Alrighty, good morning everyone and welcome to our VMUG webcast partnered with Vali Cyber. The VMware User Group is an independent, global, customer-led organization created to maximize members' use of VMware and partner solutions through knowledge, sharing, training, collaboration, and events. Please get connected to a local VMUG community near you at vmug.com. We have communities all over the place, New Mexico, Arizona, Atlanta, you name it. During this webcast, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. This just makes it so it's very smoothly streamlined and we get to get back to you if we need to. We'll get your emails down. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat if you have general questions. And lastly, this session is being recorded. The recording will be distributed in a wrap-up email after the webcast, and we'll also post it on the VMUG YouTube channel. So please rest assured the session will be recorded and we'll be able to distribute it out to you guys afterward. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Austin.
All right, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to make the case for advanced hypervisor security capabilities at the executive level in your organization. And I want to say just a little bit about myself and Vali Cyber. So I'm Austin Gadient. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Vali Cyber. Vali Cyber was co-founded by me after my time in the US Air Force, where I was responsible for the cybersecurity of satellites, both satellites in orbit, satellite ground systems. It turns out all these devices run Linux operating systems. So I did a lot of defensive Linux security. And I ran into challenges with the existing Linux security tools that were available. And so Vali Cyber started as a Linux security company. And as we grew, we started to focus on hypervisors as well, because this is where we were seeing a lot of attacks and customers were asking us for hypervisor defensive capability. Now, this particular presentation is based on a lot of our experience over the last, I'd say, year and a half about. So we've had a product available to protect ESXi systems since April of last year. And part of releasing this product has been motivating organizations to use the product and bring it into their organization. We do a lot of our marketing through VMUG, and a lot of the folks that we talk to at VMUG are technical folks. They see the value in the product and then they want to know, how do I make the case to my management to adopt this? I see the value. I understand why we need it. How do we bring this into our organization? And so we're going to talk about how to make those arguments and how to make those cases to your executive management based on our experience and our success doing so over the past few years. And before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about why you should make the case in the first place. You know, what's going on in hypervisor security that makes this a problem anybody should be caring about. And so with that, we'll talk a little bit about Scattered Spider and some of the attacks that ransomware actors have been perpetrating against ESXi infrastructure. So VMware ESXi systems are targeted very frequently by ransomware actors. One of them that has been in the news recently is called Scattered Spider. And essentially, their goal is to break into the hypervisor and encrypt the virtual machines on the hypervisor, and then demand a very large ransom payment. And many organizations are going to be motivated to make that payment because of the significant impact a hypervisor breach is going to have on their infrastructure. Now, there's another sort of attack that we've also seen over the past few years, and this is an attack that's more focused on dwelling in the target network and launching further attacks from the hypervisor, essentially using the hypervisor as a beachhead. And so a good example of this would be the MITRE breach from October of 2023, or excuse me, May of 2024. October 2023 was the MGM breach, which was a ransomware attack. But the MITRE breach was in May of 2024. And essentially the goal of the attackers was to break into MITRE's virtualization infrastructure and then use the hypervisor as a landing point to launch further attacks and exfiltrate data from the environment. They recognized that they could do this because threat actors know there's typically a lack of detection and response capability on the hypervisor itself. So if they break into the hypervisor, it's a very privileged point in the network. They can do really whatever they want when it comes to their operations. They can launch further attacks from there. So two big attacks to worry about: ransomware and these sort of land and expand attacks that we see nation state organizations offering. All right, so why should you make the case? Another reason is VMware is the most popular hypervisor out there today, so it's a market leader. This is another reason why attackers tend to go after it so often. So we don't see as many attacks against Proxmox or Nutanix, not because those systems are significantly more secure, but because they're just not as prevalent. So a ransomware actor is going to focus more on going after a system that is widely used as opposed to a system that's not widely used, because they have to invest in developing malware and developing techniques to go after these environments. So let's talk a little bit about the MGM breach. The MGM breach is one that happened, as I mentioned, in October of 2023. It was a ransomware attack that was particularly devastating. It costed MGM about $100 million to recover. There was also about a $40 million class action lawsuit settlement that followed a few years after. So something that we're seeing with these ransomware attacks is the cost of the attack itself is very damaging, but often there are these class action lawsuits that follow that can also have a significant financial impact. And the way this attack worked is threat actors broke into the environment by first targeting the IT management help desk. And so essentially what they did is they used a SIM swapping attack to fake a phone number. They can also use AI to mimic voice of an administrator. They call into the help desk. They say, I need a password reset. The help desk, suspecting there's no issue because the phone number looks right, maybe the voice sounds right, they release those passwords and those credentials. Then the threat actor group used those credentials to log into the cloud environment for MGM. And from there, they moved laterally and attacked the ESXi environment. And it's worth noting that this attack was also perpetrated by Scattered Spider. So one of Scattered Spider's favorite initial access techniques is targeting IT support desks and third-party IT support desks to steal passwords or credentials to get into an organization. So now we'll see a video of what this attack really looked like in practice. So how did this actually work? And we don't have all the details of what the attackers did once they got into MGM's VMware environment, but we do know how these attacks typically look in enterprise environments. And typically what an attacker is going to do is they will turn on SSH, they will steal credentials for vCenter, they'll log into vCenter and turn on SSH for the underlying ESXi systems. Then they will log into the ESXi systems from there. And a lot of organizations think they're covered because if they don't have SSH turned on their hypervisors, they're following the best practice. We don't use SSH on our hypervisors, so we're good. The problem is that if the attacker has administrative access to vCenter, they can just turn on the SSH access themselves. And they're going to do this not during your normal business hours. They're typically going to do this sort of thing at 3 a.m. in the morning when no one is watching very attentively. This is when they're going to launch their attack. They're not going to operate on a schedule that's convenient for your organization. They're going to operate on a schedule that is convenient for them successfully launching an attack. So we're going to go ahead and log into this vCenter environment. This is assuming the attacker has stolen the credentials. We're going to target this particular ESXi system. It has a few VMs on it that we're going to be going after. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to turn on SSH. So we'll go over to the configuration. We'll turn on the SSH service. And then the VM that we're going to target is called Walter White. That's the name of the VM that the attacker is going to try to encrypt in this action. And what they're going to do now is using that SSH access and using the stolen credential to log into the system. And from here, if you have this level of access to an ESXi system, you can do pretty much whatever you want. What the attacker is going to do is log in and head over to the data store, CD over to the data store. I'll pause the video here because they're going to do something a little bit more sophisticated than some other attacks. So some other attacks, they'll just download a ransomware binary onto the system. They'll run their ransomware as an ELF executable. This can be stopped by exec installed only, which is a protection on ESXi systems. But there's another way to launch a ransomware attack, which is a living off the land attack or a fileless ransomware attack. This is one where the threat actor is going to use the tools that are on the ESXi host to attack the ESXi host itself. So in this case, the threat actor is going to use grep to list out the files they want to encrypt. They're going to use OpenSSL to encrypt those files, and they're going to use RM to delete the original. But we'll go ahead and run this command. And we can see that the VMDK files, all the VMX files, all of them have this little nuclear extension because they've been encrypted. If we try to spin up the VM, it's not going to work. Okay, connect operation failed, VM doesn't start, and that's because the VMDK file and the VMX file, all those have been encrypted, and obviously vCenter can't start the VM when this issue happens. So this is an example of a typical ransomware attack against VMware environments that we see. So now we're going to see an example of the other sort of attack, more of a nation state attack where the attacker is trying to exfiltrate data from the network and use the environment as sort of a beachhead. The hypervisor is a beachhead to launch further attacks. And so in this example, we're going to look at the MITRE breach, which happened in May of 2024. Essentially, what attackers did is they used a specific technique. They installed VIBs, malicious VIBs, onto the ESXi host to maintain persistence. They also tampered with the acceptance level, which is a protection on ESXi host that defines what level of VIB you're allowed to install. So typically a VIB is going to have a acceptance level on the low end of community supported, on the high end of VMware accepted. And so anything that is above community supported is digitally signed by VMware. So if it's partner supported, that's the next level up, or if it's VMware accepted or VMware supported, those are going to be VIBs that are digitally signed by VMware. And that's an important distinction because those levels of VIBs are going to bypass or be allowed to be installed with exec installed only in effect, with secure boot in effect, with some other security settings available. Community VIBs, however, are not signed, and typically they're going to be disallowed by default. So how can an attacker get around that if you have a community supported VIB? Because presumably attackers don't have the ability to sign their own VIBs using Broadcom's private keys. So first, we're just going to see an example of trying to run ransomware just straight from the command line when secure boot is turned on and when exec installed only is turned on. So we're going to log into the ESXi host. We're going to run our ransomware sample. This is an example of the Akira ransomware strain. And we can see that on the right side of the screen, what we're doing is we're tailing the VM kernel log. So the VM kernel log shows this message about execution of non-installed file prevented. This is exec installed only. So it says, I'm only going to let you run programs that are installed with a VIB. If it's not installed with a VIB, you're not allowed to run this program. And so if you just copy an ELF file onto the system with exec installed only in place, you can't run that ELF. So what can an attacker do to gain persistence? Well, first, they need to understand how a VIB works. So a VIB is basically just a tar bzip file that has some XML data that defines sort of the schema for the file, the layout of all the files it puts onto the file system. So what the attacker can do is try to create their own malicious VIB. So let's try to craft our own VIB using our knowledge of the VIB schema and copy it onto the ESXi host and run our malware that way. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll copy in a malicious VIB that has our malware. We'll log into the ESXi host. And now we're going to try to install that VIB. Remember, this VIB is not signed by Broadcom. So if it's not signed, it's going to say, we're going to fail some integrity checks. We could try to force the install with a -f parameter, and we're still going to fail because it says the acceptance level is not high enough. So the acceptance level for this VIB is community because it is not actually digitally signed by Broadcom, and the acceptance level inside the VIB schema says community. So what can the attacker do now? Well, they can read the code. So if you actually take a look at trying to set the acceptance level to community supported, you can't do it just from the command line if secure boot is enabled. But ESXi is a Python program, and all that Python code is available on the ESXi host just to read and sort of understand. So if you do this, you'll run into two functions. One of them is called setHostAcceptance. The other one is called getHostAcceptance. And this is how ESXi checks the acceptance level of the ESXi host to determine if it's allowed to install a VIB with a community supported acceptance level or not. And if you dig into the code, you'll see this function, run command, advanced configuration, so on and so forth. What this is really doing is it's using something called the config store CLI. So the config store is essentially a JSON structure that's in memory that defines the runtime configuration of the ESXi host. So what the attacker can do from here is they can just bypass ESX CLI entirely to set the acceptance level. So they could just directly call the config store application to set the acceptance level to community. That operation is successful. Now they can try to get the acceptance level. We'll see that the reported acceptance level is now community supported. And now they can try to install their malicious VIB now that the acceptance level for the host is community supported. So they'll go ahead and install that malicious VIB. And they're going to try to run their malware now. Now, because the malware is installed through a VIB, it runs. If we go to the VMFS folder where this attack happened, we can see all these executables or all these VMDK files have this .akira extension. That's because this was the Akira ransomware that we used. The attacker has successfully run the ransomware attack. And this can also be used to gain persistence. So in the case of MITRE, the attacker wasn't running ransomware. They were running essentially a backdoor that allowed them to maintain access to the environment. Now, because of this breach, and because of a lot of the other breaches we've seen on ESXi systems, MITRE made a big change to the MITRE attack framework. So the MITRE attack framework is a really commonly used framework that defines tactics, techniques, and procedures threat actors are going to use on different types of systems. And so with MITRE attack version 17, ESXi was added as a platform for the first time. So just like Windows or Mac or Linux might be platforms that threat actors operate on, ESXi was specifically added to the framework because there are so many attacks happening that target this system. And there were also 4 new techniques that were added to the MITRE attack framework related to specific operations that can be used on VMware environments. Now, this is significant because what MITRE attack typically does is it influences security organizations, it influences auditors. So auditors are going to start paying closer attention to the security of VMware environments when they're determining the compliance regulations and the compliance requirements for those environments. And we have seen recently a few financial institutions fail audits because they didn't have enough controls in their VMware environment. I think a lot of that extra scrutiny is spurred by the MITRE attack framework and just the increase in attacks that we're seeing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change gears a little bit. So we talked about all this technical stuff to give some background about why you should care about hypervisor security in the first place. And that's great because VMUG audience is typically a technical audience. But if you're talking to more executive level folks, it's just going to be a bunch of technical mumbo jumbo if you're talking about acceptance levels and bibs and all this stuff. So how do you actually translate this into language that executives in your organization might care about? And so this is what we're going to transition to now. So there are a few different talking points that I think are highly relevant when you're trying to bring a security solution into your company. And keep in mind, we're going to focus things on hypervisor security, and we're going to talk about Zero Lock, which is Vali Cyber's product, and we're going to frame these arguments around Zero Lock. But these core arguments are going to be useful anytime you want to bring a security product into your environment. So it should be useful to you throughout your career, whether you're trying to do hypervisor security or whether you're trying to secure some other part of your environment as well. And so the different sorts of categories we're going to talk about are risk, compliance, return on investment, and competitive advantage. So from a risk standpoint, this is where you're asking, what is going to be the dollar impact to my business if one of these attacks is successful? What is the impact in terms of dollars, in terms of damage to my business if one of these breaches happens? And so questions you might ask yourself, are we going to be exposed to a lawsuit if we're not protecting our hypervisors? Like in the case of MGM, MGM got hit with a class action lawsuit because of their hypervisor breach. What's the worst case scenario if we do get hit with a hypervisor attack? Well, typically what we've seen from these scattered spider breaches recently, organizations tend to experience anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months of downtime. So that's sort of a metric of how you might estimate sort of damage to your environment. 2 weeks to 2 months of downtime for your private cloud. And so the other thing we have here are some equations. These equations are from ISC squared, which is a well-known organization in the security world. These equations are used to define in a quantitative form some of these risk arguments that we're talking about. So there are qualitative arguments you can make, but there are also quantitative arguments that are focused more on numbers. So the first equation that we see is ALE equals SLE times ARO. So what ALE is it's the annual loss expectancy. It's how much do we expect to experience in terms of dollar damage per year for one of these attacks? So the ALE, I think I said it was the annual loss expectancy, is the average loss expectancy. So what's the average amount of damage we might experience per year from one of these attacks? And the way you calculate it is through the SLE times the ARO. So the SLE is the single loss expectancy. That's the cost of an individual event. So let's say we get hit with hypervisor ransomware. We're down for 2 months. What is the cost of that specific event? The ARO is what is the annual rate of occurrence? So what is the probability we're going to have one of these attacks happen every year? Now, typically with a hypervisor attack, you're going to have a very high SLE because the impact of these attacks is very, very high. The ARO is going to be lower than what you might see with like phishing. We experience phishing every single day. We don't experience hypervisor ransomware attacks every single day. So the annual rate of occurrence is going to be lower, but the SLE will be very high for these sorts of attacks. So the next type of argument is a compliance argument. So we talked about how MITRE ATT&CK is influencing auditors to pay more attention to VMware environments. The sorts of questions you might think about here are, how does it impact our compliance standards if we implement a new security tool, or if auditors are paying more attention to the security of ESXi systems? Are there any controls we need to put in place? Is there anything that we're doing to protect our existing operating systems like Windows or like Linux to satisfy controls from compliance frameworks that we're not doing on our ESXi systems? So this is definitely something to consider from a compliance standpoint. Now, a return on investment argument is an interesting one. This is about, we're going to pay for a security product. And what are we going to get out of that security product? What is the benefit going to be? Typically, security products add additional management. So you're going to have someone that has to manage the security product, make sure it's working, make sure they're monitoring its alerts or something like that. So in that sense, security products add some overhead to the environment and to the organization. But it's also interesting to note that if your organization is already implementing some sort of security practice, maybe patching, maybe password rotation, something along those lines, maybe a new security product that does something in a different way or in a better way can make your life actually easier than what you're doing today. Now, generally speaking, a security product just by itself, as opposed to a totally open environment, it's not going to make your life easier all on its own, but it might make your life easier if it makes an existing protocol or process you have to follow from the security standpoint more straightforward. So the other equation we have on the screen right here is the return on security investment, or ROSI. So this is how you calculate what's the return on some new security product I want to bring into the organization. The way you calculate this is the ALE before minus the ALE after, minus the cost of the control divided by the cost of the control. And so basically what this equation is saying is there's going to be an average loss expectancy before we put this security control in place. There's going to be an average loss expectancy after we put the security control in place. The ALE after should be lower than the ALE before because the security control is providing some sort of benefit that's going to reduce the average cost of this risk in our environment. Then you take out from that, the cost of control, and you divide by the cost of control to get the return on that investment. Now, different types of security tools and different types of tools might affect different areas of the ALE equation. So for example, a backup solution that allows you to recover faster, that might end up affecting the SLE, the single loss expectancy. If you experience hypervisor ransomware, but you could restore from a backup very quickly and your backups aren't attacked by the threat actor as well, that might decrease the SLE. For another security tool that might be preventing or blocking specific behaviors on an ESXi system to stop those attacks, it will probably reduce the ARO, or the annual rate of occurrence, because the probability of a successful attack is going to be lower because you have this preventative security control in place. Finally, we have competitive advantage. So competitive advantage is, by having stronger security, do we have an advantage over our competitors, over other businesses in our market? And this is an argument that might be useful for financial institutions. Let's say you're a bank. If another bank gets breached and you don't get breached, that bank is going to experience some damage to their brand. You won't have that damage to your brand. That is good for you in that market. Another sort of business that we see this sort of argument being very effective is going to be a hosting provider or a managed service provider, where you're hosting virtual machines for someone, you're providing virtualization services for someone. If another hosting provider gets hit with hypervisor ransomware and they have a bunch of downtime, the customers are going to be very unhappy. Their brand is going to be affected very heavily. If you can prove that you're more secure, companies might be more likely to do business with you. Okay, so we talked about sort of making the case in terms of talking points. What are some of the things that you can talk about to make the case for stronger security in your organization? The other thing that we want to talk about is knowing your audience. So it's really important to understand that different people in your organization are going to care about different things. So when you're talking to a CEO or a CFO, they're going to care about different things than a CISO or a CIO. And you need to understand the individuals in your organization and know what they care about. So when it comes to a compliance and risk or a compliance argument, let's just focus just on compliance. So with the compliance argument, probably your CISO is going to care a lot about compliance. So your chief information security officer will care a lot about that. A chief risk officer, a CRO, that's not a chief revenue officer. A chief risk officer is something that you'll see in companies. They'll care a lot about compliance. They're also going to care about risk too. And the CFO is going to care about risk. The CEO is going to care about risk, because that's really the financial impact to the business of one of these attacks. And when you try to bring a new security tool in an organization and you're trying to advocate for that tool, you're going to have the sort of issue where people are going to push back. They're not going to just want to adopt it. They're really going to make you make the argument, make the case. So some questions they might ask are we doing enough right now? What happens if we do nothing? Are we good today? And so you can make an argument that no, we're not good today when it comes to hypervisor security. Threat actors are going after these environments more than ever. Firewalls have been shown to not be enough because attackers are bypassing firewalls with CVEs or with stolen credentials. So we need to do more. Another question you might get asked is, are we going to be exposed to a lawsuit? Is there some sort of legal implication by not doing anything? And you could bring up MGM. MGM experienced a massive class action lawsuit due to the hypervisor breach that they experienced. And then, of course, there's the risk question. What's the worst case scenario if we have one of these attacks happen? And typically what we've seen based on these historical breaches is 2 weeks to 2 months of downtime for your private cloud. And so that's going to mean different things for different companies. If you don't rely a lot on private cloud, maybe it's not a big problem for you. But if you do rely a lot on private cloud, if a lot of your critical workloads are on private cloud, that's going to be very important. And that will have a significant board level impact. It will have a shareholder impact if you're a public company. And will just have a big impact on the company's bottom line too. So those are really strong arguments to be made for any sort of security tool, and in particular, hypervisor security tools as well. So the other group of folks we might think about are going to be sort of your VPs, your directors, your executive vice presidents, and those focused on infrastructure and products. So they're more closer to the action, less less high level, focusing on the business, that are more focused on specific segments of the business, like the infrastructure, like the product itself. And so here, they're going to care about things like compliance as well, but they'll also really care about return on investment. If I bring a new security tool into my environment, what's going to be the management impact of that tool? My team's already busy. We don't really want to bring in a new tool if we don't have to, because my team has a lot of other things to deal with. What is going to be the management impact of dealing with this new tool? And then there's competitive advantage here, especially folks focused on products. They're going to want to know, is using this tool going to give me some sort of advantage that I can talk about over my competitors? And so when it comes to operational efficiency, it's all about, how can we deploy the solution in a way that doesn't require a bunch of effort, require a bunch of time? Can it fit into existing mechanisms that we use to already deploy tools? And when it comes to giving us an edge over our competitors, you might think about things like, hey, we're a service provider. We provide virtualization for other individuals and organizations. We want to make sure that we have perfect uptime. We don't want to have enough time, a downtime experience from a breach or from a ransomware attack. Okay, so we talked about sort of high level, what are some of the arguments you can make? Who's the audience you might end up talking to? Now we're going to put it into practice, and we're going to focus specifically on Vali Cyber's product. So Vali Cyber's product is called ZeroLock. ZeroLock does handle all these problems that we've been talking about when it comes to hypervisor security. So what ZeroLock does is it protects VMware ESXi systems and any sort of Linux-based hypervisor from ransomware and other sorts of cyber threats. And so we're the only vendor today that is certified by Broadcom to run an agent on the ESXi hypervisor and protect the ESXi hypervisor from attacks. We also protect Proxmox, KVM, and other sorts of Linux-based hypervisors too. All right, so the first thing, ROI. Is this tool going to take a lot of time and effort for my team to deploy and to use? So let's talk about how the deployment works for ZeroLock. So ZeroLock can be SaaS or it can be on-prem. So it's a management console and an agent. The agent gets deployed on the ESXi systems themselves. The management console can be hosted in Vali Cyber's cloud, or it can be hosted on-prem, and it can be totally air-gapped. So if you don't have access to the greater internet through an ESXi host, you can definitely make sure this system is air-gapped. You're not going to have any sort of feature discrepancy either. There's feature parity between a SaaS model and an on-prem model. And essentially what you do, if we're going with the on-prem example, is you take your management console, you spin it up as an OVA. It runs on Photon Linux, so it's the same version of Linux that you're running vCenter on. And you download the component from the management console that is signed and certified by Broadcom. So this is key. The solution is certified by Broadcom, which means you won't experience any sort of support issues if you use this product on your ESXi systems, because Broadcom has certified it to run on versions of ESXi from 7 and up. And we actually support version 6.7 and higher. The reason Broadcom doesn't certify on 6.7 is because they don't support 6.7 anymore, so they're not going to certify anything on 6.7. So you download this signed component, you upload it into vCenter, and then you deploy it using VMware Lifecycle Manager. So you just apply it to your individual ESXi systems like a standard ESXi update. We recognize we're not part of, or we're not solving the entirety of all your security challenges, right? We're a tool focused on something specific, doing something specific for you. So we need to plug in to whatever existing security infrastructure you might have. And the way we do this is with a webhook integration that's generic, that allows us to hook into any sort of SIEM you might be using. So if you're using Splunk or Microsoft Sentinel or Cribble or any of these different SIEMs and SIEM forwarders that you might have, we can integrate with those very easily. We've done it many times in the past. We also have email integration. So if you want to get an email every time an alert happens, we can do that too. And because the solution gets deployed just through a normal ESXi update approach, it's pretty easy to deploy. It's straightforward. It's something that you should be used to if you're updating your ESXi systems through vCenter. And the vast majority of our customers just use the default configuration. They use the default configuration. They don't need to change it very much beyond that. They don't need to do any sort of tuning for alerts. And the reason for that is a lot of ESXi systems are really sort of cookie cutter. The applications that run on the ESXi system are going to be similar when you're on one environment as opposed to another environment. And that allows you to very effectively handle any sort of false positives in Vali Cyber's lab. So we've already handled a lot of false positives or a lot of issues that you might experience on your ESXi host with that default configuration. And that's why this is what most of our customers use. Okay, so there's a strong argument for zero log in terms of return on investment when it comes to management overhead. You shouldn't experience a lot of management overhead with the solution. It's pretty much plug and play. It's a little bit of work to do up front to turn on the OVA and upload the component into Lifecycle Manager and deploy it from there. But it should fit within well-established practices that your organization is already doing. So now we're going to talk about some of the security capabilities that Zero Log provides, and we're going to map those against some of the arguments that we talked about earlier. So this is where we're going to get into the nitty gritty. How do we talk about specific capabilities and map those back to high-level arguments for why you might want to use a security solution in your environment? We're not going to talk about everything that Zero Log does. We're going to focus on a few key capabilities. So we're going to start with SSH MFA, or multi-factor authentication for command line logins. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start this video. This video is going to show us the management console for Zero Log. We've got different alerts across different categories that are at the top. We have a list of recent alerts. We also have a list of all the endpoints that are under protection. And we're going to be going after an ESXi 7 system. This ESXi 7 system has 3 VMs on it. These are the VMs that the attacker is going to try to encrypt. And we assume the attacker has stolen a password to log into the ESXi system. So they're going to use that stolen password. They're going to log in, but they're stopped right here. This is where we have MFA. If the attacker wanted to log in, they would need to have a time-based token. So we use a cell phone-based authenticator. Could be any sort of authenticator. Could be Google Authenticator or Okta or Duo, whatever you might use. Just a time-based, QR code-based authentication code that will rotate every 30 seconds. So presumably, an attacker is not going to have access to that code. That prevents them from getting access to your systems. It's also worth noting that one of the very early things that we did for this capability is we pushed all of the MFA into the agent itself. So that means that if the management console goes down, let's say you're experiencing an attack, you have network outage or a network instability, the agent can't talk to the management console. That's fine. You can still log into your ESXi systems because the MFA authentication is all done local on the agent itself. It's not having to reach out to external third-party services or out to the Zero Log management console. This means you can always log into your host no matter if the network is down or not. So how do we relate this to those high-level arguments of making the case for a security tool? Well, for SSH MFA, there's a very strong compliance argument that can be made. So typically, ESXi systems don't have MFA on this sort of command line level. They should. This is why Zero Log provides it, because a lot of these attacks result from stolen credentials. And there are a bunch of different security controls that you satisfy across different security frameworks. So these are just some examples from NIST CSF or ISO 27001. These are examples of specific controls that are satisfied just by using this one capability. And if you're working with another compliance framework, you can go ahead and figure out what the different controls are for that compliance framework and what this capability might help you with. Now, I'll give you a hint. This is something where generative AI can actually be very helpful. So LLMs like Copilot or ChatGPT have a decent understanding of the compliance frameworks and the controls in them. So you can just say a question. We use SOC 2. What controls are satisfied by an MFA solution over SSH on SOC 2? And it will give you a list of different security controls that are satisfied. It's a very straightforward way to figure out this information. Okay, so the next capability we're going to talk about is called virtual patching. So virtual patching is an example of something that provides a return on investment argument. So we're actually going to make an existing security process you have to go through easier because you have this advanced security tool on your systems. So first, let's see what it does. So we're going to use a CVE from March of this year. There were about 3 CVEs that came out that were related to exploitation of an application on ESXi called VMX. So VMX is the virtual machine process that runs VMs on the ESXi host. It is frequently targeted with escape to host exploits. So the goal of the attacker is to break into a VM, run some malicious code. That malicious code exploits the VMX process and allows them to run arbitrary code inside the host operating system or the host ESXi system itself. So to demonstrate this attack, we're going to log into a guest VM. Using that guest VM access, we're going to go ahead and run the script that executes the CVE. And when we do that, we get a new alert about ESXi VMX. So we jump into this alert. There's a list of files that we see affected. In this case, no files were affected by the attack because it was simply trying to escape out of the VMX process. This is a process tree, what we're seeing right now. This shows us the lineage of the attack, starting from the init process, all the way down to the VMX process that ran the VM that was attacked. And then we have what the attacker was trying to do. So the attacker, using this CVE, was trying to escape into the ESXi system. They were trying to start a reverse netcat session and connect back to their command and control infrastructure. But ZeroLock stopped it because ZeroLock has a rule in place, a security rule that says VMX is not allowed to start netcat, it's not allowed to start malicious shells, and a host of other things that attackers might want to do. So this is an example of a control it's not patching your code. So we're not updating your code. We're not modifying code on the ESXi system. What we're doing is we're monitoring the behavior of applications on the ESXi system, and we're blocking behavior associated with exploitation of the vulnerability. So when the attacker tries to escape to the host, it gets blocked. You still have that CVE on your system. You should still patch when you have time, but you're protected. You have a mitigating control in place. And this allows us to make a very strong return on investment sort of argument and an operational efficiency argument, where normally when a CVE comes out, especially if it's high severity, organizations have to run around like their hair is on fire to patch it. This might involve reboots and downtime in the environment, and you have to move VMs around and manage all of that sort of thing. So the nice thing about virtual patching is it's proactive. So if you have a rule in place already that handles the exploit behavior associated with vulnerability, you have a mitigating control in place. So you can handle the CVE on your timeline. You should still patch it when you do have time, but you don't have to handle it immediately. It doesn't have to disrupt your operations like it might if you don't have this sort of control in place. Now, what happens if there is no rule that ZeroLock has that handles some new CVE comes out? Well, we have SLAs that mean we will generate a response within 24 hours. So we will get you a new virtual patch that you can apply to your systems in the form of a security rule very, very quickly. And it's worth noting that virtual patches can apply to many different CVEs. So it's not like a one-to-one ratio where patching, you have a CVE comes out, you have a patch, you have a CVE comes out, you have a patch. With virtual patching, because we're focused on behavior of applications, any CVE that affects the VMX process and tries to do an escape to host exploit, that's going to be handled by that VMX rule, which is by default part of our default configuration, which means that anytime one of these new CVEs comes out that's related to escaping into the host and exploiting VMX, you have a mitigating control in place already. Makes it much easier to deal with CVEs and to deal with 0 days and new vulnerabilities that might be coming out. Okay, so the last layer of protection we're going to talk about is AI behavioral detection and automated remediation. So this is where the agent is going to look for specific behavior associated with specific types of malware, and it's going to block and potentially even undo that behavior. So what we're going to do here is that same attack that we launched when we looked at MGM early in the presentation. So we're going to use living off the land attack. We are going to use grep to list out the files for a VM called Gandalf. We're going to use OpenSSL to encrypt the files. We're going to use RM to delete those files. So when we put all those commands together, it's living off the land attack because those commands are natively installed on ESXi, but we got kicked off the host. ZeroLock saw that behavior and it stopped the activity. Now, if we jump back to the ZeroLock management console, we see a new alert about ransomware that has been killed. We see a list of files that were affected by the attack. So this involves a VMDK that was encrypted. Unfortunately, a VMDK was encrypted by this attack. If we go to the process tree, we can see the applications involved in the attack. So we can see the OpenSSL applications, the RM commands that were used to delete files. We can see all the commands that the attacker used to launch the ransomware. If we try to spin up the VM, it's not going to work because that VMDK file was encrypted. So this is a bad day if you're an administrator, but ZeroLock has what we call the easy button, the remediate button. So this allows us to undo any damage to the file system. So any files that were affected by the ransomware attack, we can restore the original file. We can also remove the file that was encrypted. So now when we try to run the VM, it starts up fine. There's no issue. Now, it's worth noting that for the purpose of demonstration, we set things up so that we had to click that remediate button. So we had to go in there. The attack was killed first, so the attacker got kicked off the system. We had to go press that remediate button to automatically restore the files. But the default configuration for ZeroLock is just to automatically remediate. So if we ever see ransomware behavior on your ESXi system, we're going to automatically kick the attacker off. We're going to automatically restore the files back to their pre-attack state. When it comes to making the case to your executive leadership of why we want this capability, risk reduction is a big one. So this will reduce the cost of downtime. You can remediate things within seconds instead of minutes or hours or days when it comes to traditional backups. You can go ahead and protect your environment in a way that other organizations might not be protecting their environment, which also provides a competitive advantage sort of argument. We have advanced security in place. We're less likely to experience downtime because of that advanced security. Go with us instead of our competitors. And this is particularly useful if you're a VM hosting provider or a web hosting provider. Okay, so to finish up, I'm going to put a few QR codes up there on the screens. The QR codes are to different white papers and resources we have available to help you make the case within your organization or to help you understand ZeroLock. So there's a data sheet that just goes over what ZeroLock is, what it does, what it supports. There is an executive briefing, which sort of gives you, what is going to be useful when you're talking to executives about this sort of capability. And then there's why hypervisor security, why now? This is all about, so what? Why do we care about this? What's the big problem in the first place? This goes into the topics from the early part of the talk where we talked about specific attacks. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to questions. I also believe that Megan from the Vali Cyber team, she's our VP of marketing, she should have put links into the chat that go to these QR codes as well. So those are available in the chat too. Now we will field any questions from the audience.
Thanks, Austin. That was fantastic. Yes. So I did put those QR codes into the chat window in case anyone would rather use that. We've already got some really great questions in there. Quick shout out to Thomas for those acronym definitions. Really appreciate that. Brian was asking if Vali Cyber or ZeroLock is installed as a component add-on in the LCM.
Yeah, so it's basically exactly that. It's a component add-on in Lifecycle Manager. You can also use Fleet Manager if you're already on VCF 9. You upload the component into Lifecycle Manager or Fleet Manager, and from there you deploy out using Lifecycle Manager or Fleet Manager the component onto your individual ESXi system. So you could also put that component into a new baseline or into a new ISO image, and then it could just be present anytime you install a new ESXi host in your environment.
Awesome. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to leverage that webinar chat window and we'll get to them. Ben had a couple questions. He was asking, what is the restore methodology? Where was the original stored from?
I see. So with the remediation
With
capability,
remediation.
yeah.
Mhm.
So we have a cache on the ESXi system. Typically, what we do is we set up a data store for that cache, and that cache hosts changes to files. So if we see files being written, files being modified, we will keep that cache available. It's sort of a hot cache, so it's only going to operate on the most recent activity. It's also going to only fill up if there's activity happening on the hypervisor level. So if your VMX process is modifying its VMDK, we're not going to be backing up the VMDK because the VMX file, the VMX process is supposed to modify the VMDK. But if OpenSSL is modifying the VMDK, this is when we're going to be tracking those changes so that we can restore. And we do have the ability to set the size of that cache so we can make it as small or as large as it makes sense for your environment. We can also set various parameters like the maximum age of files in that cache so that things can age out more quickly or more slowly based on the amount of storage you have. Typically, we recommend that that cache is as large as your 3 largest VMDK files.
Got it. Ben had another question, which is, does Vali Cyber provide any information about the attacker so that one might add blocking rules to edge routers and firewalls?
Absolutely. So if the attack comes from a specific IP address, we will give you information about the IP address it came from in the alert. We'll give you that full process tree that shows you all the commands that were executed, and we'll give you the list of files that were affected. So you'll have all that information available so that you can then take other steps in your security environment to further secure the host against further attack.
Awesome. That's all the questions we have right now. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
There are a few in the Q&A. So one of them is, do we send early alerts to customers or only by MITRE notes? And so that question is answered by, we do send, if you're talking about, just alerts from the management console, we're going to alert you on any sort of activity the system's configured to alert on. So it's not just MITRE techniques. There'll be things like SSH attempts. There'll be things like trying to kill VMs. That's not a specific MITRE technique per se, but it's something that's associated with threat actor behavior. So we are going to give you alerts all throughout the different attack chain and all the different tactics and techniques a bad guy might use. It's not just limited to what MITRE puts out. Now, if you're talking about virtual patching in response to CVEs, we are going to handle CVEs individually. And if we have a rule in place that already handles a CVE, we let our customers know that. And even if there's not a CVE for a vulnerability, so let's say we're looking at the prone-to-own vulnerabilities that came out in, I guess that was just a couple months ago. It took Broadcom a little while to patch those vulnerabilities. We still had a response. We had a virtual patch available for our customers to handle it.
Awesome. Martin was wondering if you can share, do you know what version of ESXi MGM was using when they got attacked?
We do not know that information today because that information has not been released. The MGM attack that I showed is just what we believe to have happened based on all the data we have about typical enterprise attacks. So that's an example of a typical enterprise attack. It's probably what happened to MGM as well. That detail about what specifically happened, what specific malware was used, that was never released publicly.
Thanks. Let's see. SSH CLI is protected. How about console sessions? Jeff is asking this.
Yes, it is. So the SSH MFA applies to SSH sessions, but it also applies to the local shell as well. This is important because another way that bad guys get onto the systems is using iDRAC to access the physical console. So the physical console is also monitored, and also we have MFA in place there too.
Awesome. Brian was curious if Vali Cyber is certified to work on Dell VxRail.
This is a great question. We get this question often. So we're working with Dell right now to get certified. In fact, at VMware Explorer, we got connected with the right people at Dell. So we're in the process of being certified on VxRail currently.
Awesome. Let's see. What assurances do we have that Vali Cyber isn't going to become the problem like the CrowdStrike issue we're all too familiar with was? This is from me.
So we will never push out automatic updates to your systems. All the updates have to be done explicitly by you. So there's no background updates that are just done automatically to your systems. And this way you can do A/B testing. If you want to, if we recommend a configuration change or a new rule or something like that, you could put that rule in place for a few of your hosts, let it run for a day, make sure there are no issues, and then apply it to the rest of your hosts. But we're never going to automatically push anything out to your systems because we recognize hypervisors have very high uptime requirements. This is why we got certified by Broadcom. The solution actually runs in a resource sandbox. So I think I forgot to mention how many resources we use. On average, it's only about 50 megs of RAM and about less than 5% of one single CPU core. So it's a very lightweight agent. We've done a lot of work to make sure it's not going to cause stability issues or performance issues on your hypervisors.
Thank you. Let's see. Brian was curious what the licensing model for Zero Lock is.
The licensing model is per core. So we also do volume tier discounts. So the more cores you have, the lower price per core you get. I don't know the pricing sheet off the top of my head. I'm not a sales guy, but if you want to get that pricing information, feel free to reach out to us at info@valicyber.com, and we can definitely get you that data. In fact, let me go ahead and pop that email address up on the screen. So that's info@valicyber.com. If you want specific pricing information for your environment, reach out to us and tell us how many cores you have, and we can get you a specific price.
Thanks. And Nathan, you had mentioned, said we'd mentioned RAM usage, but not CPU. So yeah, so it's memory, 50 megabytes of memory and 100 megabytes of disk space. So definitely trying to run light.
Yeah, and then on the CPU side, it's on average less than 5% of one single CPU core, and that'll be per agent. So every agent is going to use on average less than 5% of one CPU core on the ESXi system where it's deployed. So it is pretty light from a CPU standpoint as well.
Yeah. Brian was also wondering if this product could also work in VMware cloud environments like VMC on Azure or GCVE on Google.
So it depends on the cloud. So for example, with Azure, you don't have access to the underlying ESXi host, so you can't install VIBs on the ESXi host on Azure. So you can't install ZeroLock because you can't install VIBs. You can't install components. But on Oracle Cloud, you absolutely can use ZeroLock because you have full access to hypervisor. So you just need to make sure that if your cloud provider is providing you access to the underlying hypervisor, yes, you can use ZeroLock. If you don't have the ability to update the hypervisor or apply components to the hypervisor, then no, ZeroLock is not available for that cloud provider.
Got it. And then Brody was curious if there's visibility into the use of Power CLI or similar tools.
Yes. So when people execute Power CLI commands remotely on the ESXi host, they get executed through an application called hostd on ESXi, and we do monitor hostd's activity. We do monitor those Power CLI commands so we can block certain things or detect and alert you on certain things that will be happening through Power CLI. And this is important because threat actors will use Power CLI, so it is an important attack surface to make sure that you're monitoring.
Thank you. We've got just a couple more questions, so I think we may run just slightly over to make sure everybody's questions get answered. Ben was curious how your ESXi MFA is different from what Broadcom provides through SSO and IDM.
So the MFA that we're providing is on the command line level. So the SSO IDM capability, that's going to be at the vCenter level. So they're doing MFA of essentially the web GUI. We're focused on the command line itself. Another capability that we're developing, it's not out yet, but we're coming up with, is marrying the rules that we have with MFA. So let's say if someone executes a specific command on your ESXi systems, we will MFA that specific command so that, you know, maybe it's a sensitive command, maybe it's something you only want specific users to do. That specific command will require an MFA or even a second approver. So the capability that we have now that's different is the command line MFA for command line logins. We're adding a new feature as well that's focused on just generic commands executed on the ESXi host.
Awesome, thank you. And Ben was also curious if you could comment on the inflection point of ZeroLock. Read the Broadcom CVE remediation policy. There are some CVEs that don't always meet the severity threshold for Broadcom patches.
Right. So when we handle CVEs, the response time that we give is 24 hours for a CVE that's 7 and higher. Now, if you want virtual patches for lower CVEs, that's something we can talk about. We can work it into your contract. And we do provide virtual patches for CVEs that have a CVSS score lower than 7. It's just not going to be done on that 24-hour time frame. But if you do have a low severity CVE that you want patched immediately, that's definitely something we can put into the SLAs for your specific contract.
Thank you. And then Ben was also asking if there's trial licenses for VMUG members to try in home labs. Ben, I'm so happy you brought this up. We do actually have an application program. You just have to fill out a simple form to apply for a license. And the URL for that is valicyber.com/VMUG. I've just put that link into the chat for anyone who may want to apply. And this is exclusively for VMUG members as a thank you to you guys for being a part of VMUG as well as joining us here today. Austin, this was really fantastic. I appreciate you giving your time. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us, and we will hand things back over to you, Tristan.
Scan this QR code for any future VMUG webcasts. And then we have user cons going on. We just had one yesterday in Atlanta. We have one in Boston in 1 week's time. Another one coming up in Dallas. We also have some going on in Europe, all over the world. So please tune in to our events. And lastly, I know there were questions about whether or not the session was recorded. It was recorded. It will be distributed via email, and it will also be on the VMUG YouTube channel. So please tune in. We'll have that uploaded hopefully by end of day, worst case tomorrow. Use code community for 10% off a 1-year VMUG Advantage membership. And then lastly, after this webcast concludes, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. Please fill this out. It helps us provide you fresh, relevant content for future webcasts. So thank you all and see you next time. Oh, Megan, you got
Really
one more
quick
thing?
shout out. Yeah, I just wanted to say, actually, you made me remember Austin's actually going to be at the VMUG UK next week. So if anyone is joining us from EMEA and is planning to head to London, make sure you you touch base with Austin and say hi. He'd love to see you.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you all and take care.
Have a good one, folks.
Thank
Bye.
you.